Mr. President, Madam Vice President, members of the court, I appear before the court for the first time. It's a great honor for me to do so on behalf of the Union of Myanmar. I will address you on the last of the prerequisites for the indication of provisional measures, namely the requirement that there must be a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights in dispute in its final decision. In 4 cases in which a request for provisional measures was not granted, the applicant state had failed to demonstrate urgency of the measures sought. We argue that notwithstanding what you heard from Mr. Reichler yesterday, the case for ordering provisional measures in this case is not blindingly obvious. We argue that the Gambia's request fails to meet the threshold for provisional measures as developed in the court's jurisprudence and fails to satisfy the requirement of urgency. I will develop 4 points in these submissions. The first is that in order to meet the final requirement, the Gambia needs to satisfy the court that there is a real and imminent risk of Myanmar committing breaches of the Genocide Convention prior to the conclusion of these proceedings. Secondly, the current situation in Myanmar is inconsistent with the existence of an imminent risk of genocide. Myanmar is currently engaged in repatriation initiatives to support the return of displaced persons presently in Bangladesh. These have the support of a range of regional and international actors, support which would not be forthcoming if there was an imminent or ongoing risk of genocide. Thirdly, Myanmar is currently engaged in a range of initiatives aimed at bringing stability to Rakhine State, protecting those who are there or who will return there, and bringing to account those responsible for past violence, actions which are inconsistent with it harboring genocidal intent, as alleged by the Gambia yesterday. Finally, the Gambia has failed to provide any evidence to support its claim that the recent instability in Rakhine State is attributable to Myanmar and fails to acknowledge the role of the insurgent groups in the region. I will now turn to the legal principles relevant to provisional measures. The requirements of irreparable prejudice and urgency are well established in the court's jurisprudence. However, it's useful to make 2 brief observations on how these principles apply to the Gambia's request. The first is that provisional measures are indicated only where there is a risk that irreparable prejudice could be caused to the rights sub judice. The court would therefore need to be satisfied that there is a real and imminent risk of Myanmar committing breaches of the Genocide Convention prior to the conclusion of these proceedings. All this, of course, is assuming that the court is satisfied that it has jurisdiction, that the Gambia has standing to bring this claim, and that there is a plausible case that the breaches of the Genocide Convention might occur, which, for the reasons given by Professor Chabas and Mr. Seika, is not the case. The second is that provisional measures are concerned with future threats, not past events. The court must be satisfied that there exists today a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the claimed right. I turn now to address the application of these principles in the circumstances of the case at hand. There are 4 submissions that I would like to develop in that regard. My first point goes to urgency. The decision to launch these proceedings was taken as early as March 2019. The application was then filed as late as November 2019, more than half a year later. So was there something that happened in November or October that made them urgent? If the Gambia really believed that there was an urgent need to protect, would it not have shown greater diligence in bringing its case and its request for provisional measures? The Gambia's request fails to advance a change in circumstances necessitating this application. The second submission is that a number of regional and international actors are currently supporting repatriation in Rakhine State of displaced persons currently in Bangladesh. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees has been at the forefront of supporting repatriation efforts. Together with the United Nations Development Programme, it has entered into a memorandum of understanding with Myanmar regarding the repatriation process in June 2018. In May of this year, the memorandum of understanding was extended until 5th June 2020, And in August, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees confirmed its continuing support for the repatriation effort. The United Nations Development Programme, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees are currently implementing a total of 43 quick impact projects in Rakhine State. As part of a confidence-building exercise, we know that senior officials from Myanmar have met with displaced persons in Bangladesh with the support of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Mr. President, members of the court, it is improbable, to say the least, that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, an organization with eyes and ears on the ground, will be facilitating meetings between displaced persons with a view to their repatriation to Myanmar.
Mrs. Okowa.
Yes. Sorry,
could you kindly speak more slowly for the interpreters?
I will just go over the last sentence then. Mr. President, members of the court, it's improbable, to say the least, that the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, an organization with eyes and ears on the ground, would be facilitating meetings between displaced persons with a view to their repatriation to Myanmar if there were any reason to believe that those who would return are at imminent risk of genocide. The unequivocal and continuing support of both the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and the United Nations Development Programme for Myanmar's repatriation program cannot be reconciled with the suggestion of such a risk. What is more, in November this year, the Association of Southeast Asian States expressed their support for a more visible and enhanced presence and enhanced role for ASEAN to support Myanmar in providing humanitarian assistance, in facilitating the repatriation process, and promoting sustainable development of Rakhine State. This was the position reached following the deployment of the ASEAN Emergency Response and Assessment Team from Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand to Myanmar in March 2018 to assess the readiness of the transit and reception centers. In their assessment, the ASEAN team found that systems prepared by Myanmar government for the repatriation of returnees are all in place and operational, noting that it is evident that significant efforts have been made by the government of Myanmar to facilitate a smooth repatriation process. Bangladesh, the country that has borne the brunt of the crisis, has also entered into a memorandum of understanding with Myanmar to provide an organized framework for repatriation of displaced persons. Under the memorandum, there shall be no restrictions on the number of persons who will be repatriated as long as they can establish bona fide evidence of their residence in Myanmar. This is proof of the fact that Bangladesh, as Myanmar's close neighbor, is not of the view that Muslims are at risk of imminent genocide should they return. Mr. President, members of the court, neighboring states have also provided practical support for the repatriation effort. For example, in February of this year, China donated 20 trucks to the Committee on Repatriation and Resettlement of Displaced People, and Japan provided $37 million to cover the humanitarian and development projects in Rakhine State throughout 2018. At a meeting on November 4, 2018, between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Myanmar State Councilor, Mr. Modi confirmed his unequivocal support for the repatriation of refugees from Bangladesh as being in the best interest of the three neighboring states. And in November 2018, the United Nations Secretary General, Special Envoy to Myanmar, Christine Schreiner Bugana, met with government officials of Myanmar and discussed, amongst other things, the return of displaced persons and the potential use of third-party mediation to reduce the fighting in Rakhine State. Mr. President, members of the court, these arrangements are repeatedly referred to by these agencies as the only uncontested solution to the humanitarian crisis in Rakhine State. It is true that few displaced persons have returned. A number of factors may account for this. There is the continuing insurgency in Rakhine between Myanmar's armed forces and the Arakan army. Secondly, the displaced Muslim residents of Rakhine have made their return conditional on a number of demands, including the grant of full citizenship, their recognition as a distinct ethnic group, return of land, and compensation for past injustices. These demands sit uneasily with the suggestion that they are at risk of imminent death. Both the requirements of citizenship and ethnicity remain contested, and as yet there is no consensus on the issue. There is no doubt that instability is deterring many from returning, but, and this is significant, it is a concern shared by displaced persons of a number of ethnicities. The fact is that the insurgency in Rakhine State has led to the displacement of people of varied ethnic and religious backgrounds, including ethnic Buddhist Rakhine, Hindus, and Muslims. It's not the case that the region is dangerous for Muslims, but safe for other ethnic groups. Yet you heard not a word yesterday about the plight of other communities in Rakhine. The key point is that the support for these repatriation initiatives from these sources and the broader international community evidences a shared understanding that their return does not present imminent danger and is obviously inconsistent with the existence of an imminent risk of genocide occurring in Myanmar. The third point that tells against the existence of any imminent risk of genocide is that Myanmar is currently engaged in a wide range of initiatives aimed at bringing stability to Rakhine province, protecting those who are there or who return there, and bringing to account those responsible for past violence. It's not possible in the short time available to provide a comprehensive list of the actions which Myanmar has taken so far. I will confine myself to highlighting initiatives taken in two key areas. First, Myanmar has taken a full range of initiatives to improve the overall stability and enhance the development of Rakhine State. These have included the establishment of the Central Committee on the Implementation of Peace, Stability, and Development of Rakhine State, led by the State Councillor, Myanmar's agent in these proceedings. The Rakhine State Investment Committee, tasked with enabling local communities to derive benefit from investment, as well as to promote participation by the local population. The Committee for Supporting Peace and Stability in Rakhine, and the Advisory Commission on the Rakhine State, then chaired by the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, to advise on how best to achieve stability, development, and meaningful coexistence between the different groups in Rakhine province. In a recent report, progress was recorded in implementing recommendations by the Commission. This included significant investment in transport, infrastructure, with the construction of 9 industrial roads nearing completion and 49 bridges in progress, as well as the implementation of 100 new houses for the relocation of Taung Pao, internally displaced people's camp. Secondly, the government of Myanmar has undertaken several initiatives to investigate the violence that occurred since the regrettable events of 2016 and 2017. This has included the establishment in December 2016 of the Investigation Commission on Maung Daung to probe into the background causes of the attacks on 9th October and 12th to 13th September 2016. In February 2018, a military court established in Mansi Township sentenced 6 soldiers to 10 years imprisonment for their role in the killing of 3 men. The establishment in July 2018 of the Independent Commission of Inquiry to investigate the allegations of human rights violation and related issues in Rakhine State is also worth noting. We also have the establishment in March 2019 of a military court of inquiry to investigate incidents relating to the terrorist attacks which occurred in Budidaung, Maudang region. The Court of Inquiry has conducted investigation in Budidaung and Maudang townships. On the 25th of October 2019, it was announced that the military court will begin court-martial proceedings against a group of soldiers involved in fighting against the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army in Gudapin village in Budidaung Township. Regional and international bodies, including the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have expressed support for these measures aimed at accountability. Mr. President, members of the court, these initiatives, as well as the international effort to repatriate displaced peoples, are completely at odds with the case presented by the Gambia. If the Gambia's allegations were to be taken at face value, it would have to follow that in all of the aforementioned initiatives, Myanmar is acting in bad faith, participating in all these initiatives, whilst in truth harboring an entirely inconsistent genocidal intent. Such bad faith on the part of a state cannot be assumed by the court, even at the provisional measure stage, in the absence of sound evidential basis to that effect. Turning to Gambia's case, it's worth noting what is omitted from the portrayal of the current situation, no doubt quite deliberately. Conspicuously absent is any acknowledgement of the complexity of the situation in Rakhine State. There is no mention of an ongoing insurgency in Rakhine between militant Muslim groups, Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, and separatist Rakhine groups like the Arakan Army, opposed to the union with Myanmar. Significantly, the Gambia does not cite any material which conclusively attributes recent attacks against homes and villages to the organs of the state of Myanmar. What is more, no state in the region, not even Bangladesh, has asserted that the displaced persons, if returning to Myanmar, would be at risk of genocide. So, for example, the International Crisis Group, in its most recent report, noted the role of the ethnic armed groups such as the Arakan Army, the separatist group excluded from the peace talks, in aggravating conflict. And just last week, the Arakan Army claimed responsibility for an attack on a ferry carrying government officials. Much is made in the application of the alleged restrictions on the freedom of movement of Muslim groups in Rakhine, who are confined in displacement camps where access is strictly controlled by Myanmar military police. But the Gambia does not mention that the deployment of the police is due to security considerations. It fails to indicate that these restrictions on movement have affected access of all communities, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, to education and also to health services. In fact, a 2019 preliminary needs assessment done by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations found that the local community in Rakhine view the presence of border guards as a critical element in rebuilding public confidence and deterring potential conflicts. The allegation of a state-sponsored policy of starvation is not supported either. The application instituting proceedings cites only 3 documents at footnote 197 to 198, one of which is a fact-finding mission's detailed findings, merely referring to 2 other documents. One of these other documents does not refer to any deliberate state policy of forced starvation, but merely refers to concerns of people reportedly experiencing conditions of forced starvation. The other is a statement by Ms. Yang-Hee Lee, who says that there appears to be a policy of forced starvation in place, but does not give any further particulars. The region, it's acknowledged, is facing a period of great instability. There's no doubt that this is having consequences for civilians caught up in the unrest. At Myanmar's request, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, comprised of the ICRC and the Red Crescent societies, have been providing humanitarian assistance in Maung Dao and Sitwe districts. The World Food Programme has been present with Myanmar's support since 2017, and it is significant that the World Food Programme, in its monthly briefings, has made no suggestion of a policy of starvation. In fact, what it reports is food shortages affecting non-Muslim ethnic groups attributable to ongoing fighting with insurgent groups. Again, the various states and organizations who are supportive of the repatriation process have not suggested that there's any state policy of starvation in place, and it's hardly likely that they will be promoting repatriation efforts if they considered that there was any such risk. To summarize, the ongoing causes and consequences of the hostilities in Rakhine State are complex and difficult to disentangle. The court is not in a position to work through the disputes of fact in the context of a provisional measures application. What is clear is there is simply no evidence that the Muslim community is at risk of acts deliberately aimed at them by Myanmar's organs at their destruction as a group, in whole or in part. Mr. President, members of the court, in our submission, the request provides no factual basis for the conclusion that there is an imminent risk of Myanmar committing breaches of the Genocide Convention. On the contrary, Myanmar has made and continues to make great efforts to de-escalate the conflict that affects Rakhine State and to advance peace, stability, and reconciliation in the region. Myanmar's efforts have been endorsed by the international actors at the highest level. Importantly, they are recognized by regional and international players, including China, Indonesia, and Japan, as the only realistic solution to a humanitarian crisis against the backdrop of an ongoing insurgency in Rakhine. It's on this note that I turn briefly to the court's discretion whether or not to order provisional measures, even if it considers that the criteria of Article 41 are met. In this case, there's a powerful factor that goes to discretion. To quote the late UN Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan, speaking at the time of the publication of the Advisory Commission's interim report, the challenges facing Rakhine State and its peoples are complex, and the search for lasting solutions will require determination, perseverance, and trust. If this court were to find that there is an imminent risk of genocide in Myanmar, it would create an immediate and insurmountable obstacle to the current repatriation effort underway. This is a highly relevant factor for the court to consider when determining whether or not to grant provisional measures. However, I do stress again that Myanmar firmly and emphatically denies that the criteria in Article 41 are met in this case. This concludes the first round of oral pleading of Myanmar, and I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention.